Permission, I'm going to. Everyone's been muted, and I'll take a moment to welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. I want to thank Bernie Falk and Professor Stephen Wilf and the members of our Education Committee for conceiving of and organizing the special series of Zoom sessions to help us think about and learn about the most pressing issues of our day. And I want to thank the Jewish Center's community scholar, Raizi Chechik, who will moderate this evening's program. Raizi is the former head of school of the Manhattan Day School and is a doctoral candidate at the Bernard Revel Graduate School at Yeshiva University. And to everything she does, she adds professionalism and positivity, thoughtfulness, and lyricism. And it's a bracha to have her part of the Jewish Center community. It's a beautiful medrash right near the beginning of our parsha that I wanted to share as we open. The Torah tells us, "V'asu Aron," and the medrash comments, why is the command to make the Aron in the plural, right? Mibnei ma b'chol hakelim ha'elek ksiv v'asiso b'aron ksiv v'asu Aron. And the Gemara answers, Amar Yehuda bar Shalom, Amar le'Kadosh Baruch Hu Yavo hakol v'yasku ba'aron k'dei sheyusku kula l'Torah. So other implements might belong to one individual or one group of people. But when it comes to the Aron, when it comes to the Torah belongs to everyone, and everyone is involved in the construction of the Aron. And when it comes to Jewish learning, the goal is for everyone to be involved. The question is, how do you make that happen? Now, everyone has their own interests, everyone has their own talents. How do you organize people into a project directed toward one central goal? And the answer, of course, is that it takes an organizer, it takes a connector. In the fields of Jewish scholarship, when it comes to putting people in projects together, there are few people as talented as Menahem Butler. He knows the comprehensive bibliography of every Jewish topic, and he's on a first-name basis with every scholar noted in that bibliography, provided that they're still living. And so in record time, he's able to put together books and anthologies that include all the most important names, the names of people we know, and all the names of the people we ought to know. By day, he's the program fellow for Jewish legal studies at the Julius Rabinowitz program on Jewish and Israeli law at the Harvard Law School. And he's also a contributing editor at Tablet Magazine and co-editor of the Sepharim blog. If memory serves, and you'll correct me if I got this wrong, Menachem, but I think the last time you spoke in person at the Jewish Center was in honor of Elie Wiesel, with a specific emphasis on the time that Elie Wiesel spent at Disneyland.
That's right.
So sadly, the events of October 7th have made those lighter topics seem like they belong to a very distant past, but the sobriety of our moment only makes tonight's topic all the more urgent. To lead our conversation about Menachem's recently edited book, Praying for the Defenders of Our Destiny, the Mishaberach for IDF Soldiers, it's my pleasure now to turn things over to our community scholar, Raizi Chechik.
Good evening. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Such a pleasure to see so many of you. I echo Rabbi Levine's statements of gratitude to you, Rabbi Menahem, for showing up tonight to share your scholarship with us. And I'd like to add 2 additional points of thank you, one building on what Rabbi Levine already mentioned, but I think there isn't a student or scholar in the field of Jewish history who hasn't benefited from your incredible generosity of spirit with your almost unfathomable breadth of bibliographic wisdom. And I count myself among the students in that category, and thank you. And collectively, on behalf of our community, for this very, very magnificent work that you have just produced. We are experiencing such difficult times, and with this combination of scholarship and inspiration and relevance that I think characterizes most of the works that you edit, it helps kind of give like a framing and a spiritual approach to that which we are experiencing. So an individual thank you and a collective thank you. I must ask, this book, which I am now almost done reading, last 20 pages, all 570 magnificent pages of it, appeared on the Jewish literary landscape in December, am I correct, of 2023, about 8 weeks after the Shabbat Shchorah. of October 7th. Can you speak to the genesis of this work? Was it a project that had been in the planning stages already and you accelerated it as a response to the events, or did you manage to pull it together in 8 brief weeks? And if the answer is yes, which I see in your smile that it is, then the sub-questions for that on briefly how, but more deeply in choosing how to respond to these tragic and painful events of all the different liturgical options, the prayer for the Medina, the prayer for the captives, which is certainly highly relevant, our liturgical tradition, our theological tradition. What made you select this prayer for the soldiers as sort of the fulcrum of this work?
Thank you very much, Raizi. Thank you very much, Rabbi Levine, to Bernie Falk, to Professor Wilf, and to the members of the Jewish Center community for welcoming me back and inviting me this evening. This book started to be worked on shortly after October 7th. That Shabbat, my wife and I were at home in Sharon, Massachusetts, and we were in shul when we heard the news. And like in so many other congregations, when it came to put the Torah away, different points in the Chukah, when people recite it, prayer for the IDF soldiers was recited, and there wasn't a dry eye in the synagogue. And over the next few days, in between listening to the news after Yom Tov, listening to the news, just hearing what's happening every minute, every hour, I switched from listening to the news to listening to music. And the music that I was trying to listen to connect with Achenu Kol Beit Yisrael in Medinat Yisrael was that of Israeli music. And in particular, the Mishaberach for the Chayalim, the Mishaberach for the IDF soldiers. I regularly am in touch with Israeli scholars of all ages, very, very senior scholars to very young scholars. And in the immediate few days after the attacks of October 7th, I wasn't sure how to reach out to people in Israel. I didn't know what to ask. I knew the question of how are you doing? What do I say? And so I reached out to an elderly professor and I said, I don't know what to ask. What should I be asking? How does one reach out to somebody at this time? And he said, just reaching out, letting us know that you're thinking about us, letting us know that Jews in America are thinking about us, are praying for us, and just keeping us in their thoughts and not forgetting us. Of course, first and foremost, praying for the hostages to be returned and praying for the safety and security of Medinat Yisrael and the IDF soldiers. One of the people who I would regularly speak with, a dear friend, a mentor, Professor Aviad HaKohen, who was a scholar in residence at the Jewish Center, I believe, last year, within the past year or so. I sent him a text message, a WhatsApp, and I said, Aviad, I'm thinking about you and your family. How can I help? What can I do? We started talking about some ideas of researching projects. And in particular, I said, if you look in the various prayer books that are used, the various Sidurim that are used in modern Orthodox communities, and for this, I'll point to the 1986 RCA edition of the Art Scroll Siddur, the Koren edition of the Sachs edition of the Koren Siddur. The prayer, the text of the Mishaberach for the IDF soldiers is there, alongside the prayer for Medinat Yisrael, for the state of Israel, among other prayers. But I said, but yet there's very little commentary into those passages. And even that which is there is just, in the classic, beautiful Rabbi Sachs fashion, offering, an insight into a sentence, but really taking a step back as to what this prayer is, what's the purpose of it, what's the machshava that we ought to have when reciting it. Just think about, looking at a the Yom Kippur Machzor and the story of the Unatana Tokef, just how a person gets, according to the tradition of the Art Scroll Siddur, quoting the Ars Arua, what machshava ought one to have when reciting this prayer. And I was then thinking back to the Mishaberach for the idea of soldiers, and how come there isn't much there? So I asked Aviad, I said, so who's the definitive scholar who's written about the origins of the prayer for the IDF soldiers? And he said, funny you should ask. He said, well, the scholar who's written the definitive work, his name is Professor Aaron Arend from Bar Ilan University, who is a fantastic scholar of rabbinic literature, just put out a new edition of Rashi to Masechet Megillah, or Masechet Makot. And he also has written a number of serious pieces of scholarship about religious Zionism. In fact, a book that he published in the late 90s is all about halachot related to Yom HaAtzmaut. And this is a volume published in 1998 for a variety of reasons, which hopefully I'll come back to towards the end. Somewhat unknown in America, somewhat unknown in English. And in fact, with rare exception, Professor Aaron's work is all in Hebrew, and it's in an academic Hebrew, and it is in an religious Zionist academic Hebrew. And he's one person who wrote an article. And then Aviad said, but as I'm sure you know, my uncle was one of Rav Goren's assistants in the IDF chief rabbinate, military chief rabbinate, and he was involved in the composition of the Mishaberach. And just to take a step back, among the prayers that are recited for Medinat Yisrael, there's the prayer for the welfare of the state of Israel. Depending on which scholar comes to speak about it, it's either composed by Shai Agnon or of Herzog. The correct answer is it's somewhere a mix of the both. They were both involved in it. And as Aaron Arend shares in his research, in an article published 15 years ago, he tells a story of how this prayer came to be. So I reached out to Professor Arend and I asked him whether I'd be able to prepare an English translation and to have it edited to his liking. And I said, I'm interested in putting out a small book about why it's important for those of us in America who find a religious value, a religious significance of the establishment and continuity of the state of Israel and its soldiers, why we should be reciting this prayer. What should we be having in mind to the history? And I said it's going to be a book. There are going to be different types of chapters. There'll be articles on history. There'll be machshava. At that point, I didn't really have many responses from people. I had a few people who expressed an interest in participating. And then just from there, things, Professor Arendt wrote one serious article, significant article. Professor Nissim Leon, who's also a scholar at Bar Ilan University, explores the Mizrahi, the Sephardic prayer books and how they include prayers for the soldiers. And there's a variety of prayer books that are composed, that are produced, and each prayer book has a little different nusach, and each of that, it tells a story about the community that is reciting the prayer book. Those are the mega articles. And then in addition to that, I just reached out to people who I had regularly been in contact with, professors, rabbis, educators, and asked them just what message would you want those in America or those around the world to know about the importance of reciting the prayer, the Mishaberach, for the IDF soldiers. My co-editor, Aviada Cohen, whose network in the Dati Leumi religious Zionist modern Orthodox community in Israel is legendary, connected me with young Israeli artists, poets, creative thinkers, as well as to senior Rosh Yeshiva in the Dati Leumi world. Chaim Sabato, we included a translation of a piece he gave. Aviad sent him a message saying, hey, I'm working on this project in America. What do you think about it? Just the ability for him, who is so centrally involved in that community, to participate in this book, I think added a very significant, on the ground realia of the book. And so the book, over the past number of years, I've been publishing a number of books through independent publishing houses that I had started. And myself and my partner, Rabbi Dr. David Shabtai, we were thinking, it would be a good idea for this to come out around Hanukkah time. And Baruch Hashem, we raised some money to be able to offset the costs and to make it reasonably priced and available for purchase on Amazon. In addition to giving complimentary copies to Jewish students on college campuses. As Rabbi Levine mentioned, I work at Harvard Law School. I wear my yarmulke on campus. I see the students on campus, both those students who are standing strong in support of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, as well as people who are choosing to exercise their First Amendment free speech right. And there are many organizations and institutions that do wonderful advocacy and support of the students, and not only the students at Harvard, but really on college campuses. And I felt especially the first few weeks after October 7th, that while there were political and legal and educational responses that were being offered, I felt that there was somewhat of a gap within the Jewish religious perspective. And it's not a question of who to blame. I think the state of Israel is focusing on, winning the war and freeing the hostages. And the idea of hasbara in its classical sense doesn't usually trickle down to liturgical poetry or machshava. And I just felt that day by day on campus, seeing students who are standing up to people who are attacking Israel and attacking the Jewish people, I just felt that there was something lacking in, well, what is the fuel what should they be learning about? Why are the soldiers who we're praying for, who are they? What's the broader tradition it's part of? What is the role of Zionism, religious Zionism in the state of Israel? And that's, ultimately this book, how it all came together. Nearly 80 articles in here. There's a web of connections of different pieces of, somewhat of an eclectic diversity, smorgasbord, a beautiful shivim panim l'Torah, as it were, of broadly reflecting the views within our community of viewing the establishment of the state of Israel and the soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces as a significant religious event in modern Jewish history.
Thank you. There's so much to discuss, but one of my favorite chapters in this book was actually an essay that you wrote called Beyond Borders, a note on Rabbi Hillel Unsdorfer's posthumous article on the Mishberach for IDF soldiers. Actually, brought tears to my eyes reading the opening story, and I'm wondering if you could share a bit about that story that you included in the text and sort of how this article came to be.
Sure, thank you. So while the book was, with the exception of one or two articles that were written in Hebrew beforehand that we adapted or translated, 3 articles that we translated to English for publication afterwards, all the other articles were written following October 7th. And they might have been written following October 7th, but it was built on relationships with different scholars, built on research projects that existed that I had been working on in the past and been thinking about. At no point had I thought that I was going to work on an entire book about the Mishberach for the IDF soldiers. A number of years ago, and you mentioned our dear friend Larry Kaplan, Larry Coburn, who's on the Zoom. A number of years ago, I was perusing the Jewish Week on microfilm from the 1970s, as one I think does, to read obviously Rabbi Emanuel Rackman's article every week or every 2 weeks, various members of Federation World. And I came across an article about Hillel Unsdorfer, of this photograph, this iconic photograph of a young man who was a soldier during the Yom Kippur War. I think this article must have been 83, reflecting 10 years later, and how he and his platoon in Israel were taken into captivity in Egypt. And the name Hillel Unsdorfer also triggered rang a bell because the Unsdorfer family is a prominent European rabbinic family, and Hillel Unsdorfer actually was named after his grandfather, I believe, who was I believe killed during the Holocaust. All the details in the article, in the footnotes. And he was taken as a hostage by the Egyptians during the Yom Kippur War. And at the time, the various units in the IDF, and this relates to the work of the Mishaberach and its composition by Rav Goren and Chief Rabbi Shlomo Goren and his office, arranged for Sifrei Torah and Sidurim and Kashrus for the religious support of the soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces. And Hillel Unsdorfer's platoon had a Sefer Torah with them. And when they were taken into captivity, and when they were taken hostage, the question was, well, what do we do with the Torah? And so they brought the Torah with them into captivity. And there was a photograph that was taken and was shared around the world. And I'm told from people who recall at the time, a little over 50 years ago, seeing the article and the photograph of a religious soldier in the state of Israel, together with his fellow members of the platoon, not all of whom were religious, but all of whom recognized the significance of having a Sefer Torah with them, a Torah scroll with them, and it being brought into captivity with them. Just a side note, within the past 2 years, the part of the Torah was finally released. Hillel Unsdorfer and his unit were released a number of months later, and he then went and he became a rabbi. And he was a rabbin, a moshav, and in the early night, and he would frequently contribute articles to various Torah journals and newspapers. One of the newspapers in particular, and this is an important paper for the purpose of researching religious Zionism and orthodoxy in the past few generations in Israel, is the journal Hatzofeh of the National Religious Party in Israel. And that's what I knew about Hillel Unsdorfer. One of the points raised in our Professor Aaron Aren's article is, upon changing the text of the Mishaberach, if there's further, if Israel goes into Lebanon, or if the geographic borders of Israel change as a result of military incursions, do we then add a different, do we change the prayer of that Chief Rabbi Goren composed? And just to point out here, the text of the oh yeah, here it is. May he who bless our fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, bless those who serve in the Israel Defense Forces and its security forces, who stand guard over our land and the cities of our God, from the Lebanese border to the Egyptian desert, from the Mediterranean Sea to the approach of the Arava, and wherever they are on land, in the air, and at sea. The prayer then continues. The question had come up at various points over during the 80s, early 80s, and the 90s, as to whether the text of the prayer should be altered. And inevitably, this conversation took place on the pages of newspapers. It didn't really get much further than that. And the question was asked. A few weeks later, somebody writes a response. And that happened in 1993. The question was asked, somebody writes an article, oh, should we be changing the text in light of soldiers are here or there? Should we be changing the text? And Hillel Unsdorfer at the time, who was the rabbi, he was serving as a rabbi in Kibbutz Beit Rimon in the Lower Galilee. I'm just checking the book here, and he writes a letter to the editor explaining that no, we shouldn't change the text of the prayer. And in my article, I have the introduction. I tell the story behind this, the background, and then translated the text of the letter of the article that Rav Unsdorfer wrote as well. And he responds and he says, we shouldn't change the text of the prayer, because when we pray for the soldiers, we're not simply saying that, oh, because the soldier is now there, we're going to change the whole text of the prayer. We pray for the soldiers wherever they are, even if they're from beyond the borders of Israel. And when I read this, I was thinking, and I found this on microfilm sitting in the Harvard Library. When I read this, I was thinking, here's Hillel Unsdorfer, who himself served, who was a prisoner in Egypt beyond the borders of Israel. If there's anybody who could be justified in saying, yeah, you should change the prayer to include people who are living beyond borders, it is he who is the one. But he said, no, because when we pray for the soldiers, we're praying the soldiers and wherever it is that their army service takes them, willingly, unwillingly. And this is an example of how different articles begin to weave together, because the tune that we recite that is sung in many Orthodox synagogues and beyond for the Mishaberach is the words are composed by Chief Rabbi Gorin and his office, but the tune that is used is actually a Yehoram Gaon song, El Eretz Tzvi, from Operation Thunderbolt, about the Yom Kippur, about the raid on Entebbe, and that itself, that didn't take place in the boundaries of the state of Israel, but it was that wherever there's a Jew who is held in captivity, or wherever there's a Jew who's in need of saving, the Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, and the IDF are going to go bring him home. And that idea comes up in a number of the articles. And when we were putting the book together, I reached out to Chazim Yitzi Spinner, and I said, Yitzi, do you want to? Can you give me the sheet music for how to, people, for them to sing along, because that's also a form of the literary product of this book. And just in terms of the El Eretz Tzvi, the idea of the song, two articles in particular address this. One, in a very beautiful literary manner, Rabbanit Malka Perechowski compares the wording of the song composed, the words composed by Dubi Zeltzer, tune composed by Yehoram Gaon, about going El Eretz Tzvi, of going to the land of the deer, bringing the Jewish people home, and how that song, and then comparing it to the Mishaberach prayers for the soldiers. Then also, I think one of the most powerful for me articles in the book is the article by Professor Simcha Golden, whose son Hadar Golden was taken into captivity and killed, being held by Hamas the almost past decade. And he writes an article. He had previously written an earlier draft of this a number of years ago in an Israeli newspaper, and he elaborated in this piece about how his son Hadar Golden loved the song El Eretz Tzvi. And his article is titled Bringing Hadar to Eretz Tzvi. And just at this point, reading this article, it's all of a sudden it's music, it's prayer, it's father, it's son, it's just everything's mishmash together. And really that's the raw feeling of what one feels when thinking about the prayer, when reciting the prayer, and hopefully inspiring people to recalibrate towards their love of Medinat Yisrael and the soldiers.
Yeah, when I was reading that chapter, I was thinking my earliest childhood memory that I can date is actually as a 4-year-old sitting on a couch in the hot summer of July 1976, next to my mother, and she was watching the news and crying. And I remember seeing a picture of an airplane and, people dancing. And I asked her why she was crying. And she said, so some equivalent of that is our family. And bad people took them away from Israel, and our soldiers brought them back home. It's like literally my earliest dated memory. And the article by Professor Golden is definitely like a beautiful, beautiful compliment, and a moving and a emotional compliment to like a mirror imagery of the text of that and this prayer for the soldiers. At the Jewish Center, when we recite the prayer for the Chayalim, and I would say at every school I've worked in, there's like this palpable emotion that fills the room. And even not in a time of war, people who don't connect as well to the rest of tefillot, there's a like universal response to this prayer. You mentioned before Professor Leon's article about the Mizrahi, the Eastern communities, the Dota Mizrach, where even in their more Haredi communities, there are prayers said for the soldiers. But in the article, neither seen nor found. Why is the Mishaberach for Chayalim absent in the Lithuanian Haredi community? Professor Aviad Hakon addresses this bifurcation, and he speaks a bit about what he sees as some notable exceptions that give him hope. Can you share your thoughts on this article and its content, right? About perhaps the history of why this prayer is not said and some of the unique sort of dimensions of it or aspects or iterations of it that we are seeing now.
Sure. So, and as working on the book, thinking who are the various people to invite, a number of Israelis were quite offended that I asked, why should we be saying the prayer? And of course you say the prayer. Like, why shouldn't this prayer be said? And it underscored that there's somewhat of a disconnect between people's personal religious liturgical prayers and the broader national experience. So before I get to Professor Cohen's article, because it was actually the second article written in a tandem, there was a the week after October 7th, there was a news report at either Yeshiva World News or Shmeis.com or Bus is Nice or one of the Haredi bastions of journalism, lowercase j, that mentioned that the Vishnitzer Rebbe of Bnei Brak recited a Mishaberach for Chayalim on Shabbos Parshas Breishis. As soon as I saw that, I wanted to Vishnitzer Rebbe of Bnei Brak. He's a brother-in-law of the Skver Rebbe, of one of the Satmar Rebbes, and of the Belzer Rebbe. So all of a sudden, we're talking about somebody who's, if he would have a family Thanksgiving dinner, it would be a very interesting conversation. I'm not suggesting the Vishnitzer Rebbe has a Thanksgiving dinner table, but
that alone would be interesting conversation.
That alone would be interesting, exactly. But he's somebody who's very, very entrenched in the mainstream, not tangential. He's a central figure in the contemporary Hasidic community. And so which text of the prayer did he recite? Did he happen to have a Koren sitter with him, just pull out the Mishaberach, the IDF? I was just trying how does that even work? I had no idea. And I looked online, both in the various English articles, as well as the Hebrew articles that it was based on, as well as the Otzar Chachma forums, the conversations about it, looking online. And I saw that the text of the Mishaberach that the Vishnitzer Rebbe recited was not a new text. It was not that he just got up and composed something out of the blue or composed a new version. But rather it was something that had been composed in 1948 by a Menahem Mendel Geffner, who I had, until that point, never heard of by name. I was aware of something else that he was responsible for. He's the one who made popular the communal Berachos Kohanim at the Kotel on the Chagim. And he was a very Klal Yisraeli. It's very important. All Jews, we all have to get together. We have to get together. Chassidish man. And as soon as I learned this about him, I immediately went to the Harvard Library, pulled down a 2-volume book that his descendants put out, everything about Rabbi Menahem Mendel Geffner's life. And he composed a prayer at the request of, I believe, the Chabiner Rav in 1948. And it's a prayer for the soldiers, the Jews who were fighting in Israel's War of Independence. And it's not the only prayer that was composed for soldiers fighting in the War of Independence. As discussed in some of the other articles, Chief Rabbi Herzog, the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of the state of Israel, he also composed a prayer for the soldiers that was recited during the war. But then after the war, they stopped saying that prayer. What's significant about Rav Menahem Mendel Geffner's text was that several decades later, during the Yom Kippur War, the text was once again recited. And over the years, various mainstream Lithuanian Haredi or Hasidic or Hasidic rabbis, including Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, including Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, would point to this text, and as if the way I interpret it, somebody says, what text should we say? This is a text that has been accepted within that community. And within the book, we actually included the facsimile of the text as was prepared and that was said after the Yom Kippur War. Now, that's Menahem Mendel Geffner. That's the Vizhnitzer Rebbe. There were other expressions of, we don't have to call it Zionism, or acknowledging the religious significance of the state of Israel that were taking place after October 7th. Namely, one of the Satmar Rebbes said that at his congregations that are in Israel, or as he would refer to in the land of Israel, in Eretz Israel, that they should recite Avinu Malkeinu at Shachar and Mincha. Now, he's not saying that there's a religious significance of the state of Israel. He's saying that we're at a time of great worry, and they added into their tefillot, much in ways very similar to many modern Orthodox congregations, which would say Avinu Malkeinu at the time. The question of whether on Shabbos Mavarchim to say Avarachamim, which previously comes up once or twice a year on the Shabbos Mavarchim during the 3 weeks or during Sfiras HaOmer, question, should a shul say it or not? Now shuls are saying it again because it's a difficult time. One of the other articles, I sent that information about Menahem Mendel Geffner to Levi Cooper, Professor Rabbi Dr. Levi Cooper, a brilliant Talmid Chacham who teaches at Pardes in Yerushalayim, and completed his dissertation about the Minchas Elazar, at Bar Ilan University. A brilliant Talmid Chacham, and I asked him, would he be able to write an article about how contemporary Hasidim are responding post-October 7th to the soldiers of the IDF?
I'm just picturing Minchas Elazar attending Bar Ilan University, so thank you for that comment.
It's I mean, crazier things have happened, and but no. So Levi began researching and pulling some things together based on research that he had been doing in the past, looking at various Torah publications that are produced each week. You think synagogue bulletins and other forms of ephemera that are produced internally within the communities. And he found a fascinating document, which is that, as he describes it, acceptance without embrace. That's how he headlines this idea that the Boyana Rebbe, Rav Nachum Dov Breyer, those from the Upper West Side might have been familiar with his family. The Boyana Rebbe, who has Hasidim who are either themselves serving in the IDF or who have children who are serving in the IDF. So that means either they're from the families or they're just individuals. He published a small book of tefillot, I believe it was from the Palayoetz or Eliezer Papo, to just a book about prayers, tefillot. The book has been reprinted many, many, many times. And for all intents and purposes, this is a regular prayer book. It's just, thinking about the soldiers, thinking about them at this time. What's significant about the book, and this is really the greatness of Levi Cooper as a scholar and researcher, was that he looked at every aspect of the book, including on the front cover, there's a letter that the Boyana Rebbe added in of his personal prayer of well wishes for the soldiers who are for the soldiers, his Hasidim, or their family members and others who are serving in the army at this time. So officially, is this a prayer for the welfare of this? Is this a prayer for the soldiers of it? It is a prayer that he composed that is published in a book that he shared. Is it something that's going to be recited in other congregations? Not necessarily. This is a very focused for his community. Now, this all gets to the crux of your question, I think, about the Lithuanian world. After Levi Cooper finished his article, I asked Aviad if he would write an article about what the Litvish, Yeshivish version of this side looks like, because Levi discussed the Hasidic side, Professor Nissim Leon discussed the Mizrahi side, the Sephardic side, and Aviad explained to me that the question of Charedim, Lithuanian Charedim, and the Mishberach for the IDF as part of a longer question about the relationship between Zionism in the state of Israel and the Haredi community, and how this is an example of a larger question. And as a result, he describes what the challenges and what the reasons why the various Haredim would not or have not in the past recited this, ranging from reasons of the Haredi leaders of the leaders of the Haredi community at the establishment of the state of Israel, and subsequently took a hardline position about serving in the Israeli government and serving in the army. Shevet Leumi, it's another challenge that had come up that they had opposed. And the mainstream Haredi opinion is not to serve or acknowledge or elevate the significance of these soldiers. That's all fine and good, except when there are exceptions. And that's something that Aviad masterfully points out throughout the footnotes of the Haredi people who had served at different times in the army, and as well as, and this is again the beauty of working with a scholar who's so involved in the research of this era and these topics, that when Israeli soldiers came to the Panovich Yeshiva in 1956, and there's a picture of Rav Kahaneman standing for Shlomo Goren and other members of the IDF who came to visit him. And there have been many reports on various forms of social media about the enlistment of Haredim, of Lithuanian Haredim in particular, in the army, in the IDF, following October 7th. And at the time these reports began to be surfacing, I reached out to some activists within the Haredi community in Israel, asking if there's any data, like how many people, who are they, where are they coming from, which communities, what schools, are they leaving yeshiva, are they in cult, just all the different layers of it. And the response was, we don't really know yet, but we'll let you know, when we find out. And it's been 3 or 4 months, and I still haven't yet gotten back the response as to who these students are. What we do have is, and this is towards the end of the article of Aviad and I, there's a footnote that he and I wrote together, that there has been pushback from within Haredi leadership. It's always a sign of something's happening when the leaders are railing against it. And when a member of the Moetzas Gedolei Torah in Israel, who's himself a prominent Lithuanian Rosh Yeshiva, publicly says that it's forbidden for students to leave the yeshiva and to go enlist in the army, and that anybody who suggests that it's a good idea doesn't understand what it means to be a member of our community, that suggests that there is a growing concern within the community. There's no hard data yet. We don't know what the data is, but I'm confident that scholars in the months and years ahead will be looking for this information. What this practically means for members of the broader Haredi community, of reciting the prayer for the soldiers, I think as a community, they don't find a religious significance to the establishment of the state of Israel, or to the significance of the importance of the soldiers as a religious directive. So I think it doesn't come as a surprise that they're not reciting these prayers.
I will also point out a distinction that I believe Professor Cooper alludes to in his article. I remember during, I think it was Operation Desert Shield, when Yeshiva Shar HaTorah in Queens, Shar HaTorah of Grodno, right, this Lithuanian traditional yeshiva led by Rav Epstein, started saying the prayer for the Chayalim, not the prayer for the Medina, but the prayer for the Chayalim. And I remember several, Haredi synagogues in Flatbush began to do so as well. Rabbi Rabinowitz, the one who did his PhD on
Aaron Arend addresses that, right. And he had all the details. And
so I think what is something important to note is that I believe most Haredi Israelis feel deeply about the soldiers, daven for them in Avinu Malkeinu, daven, say to Him. I think there's deep care, but there's also a threat to the hegemony of the community and a risk of their joining the army if the soldiers are sort of idolized in that way. Whereas in Queens and in Brooklyn, the Haredi community doesn't have that risk. So there's a risk beyond the caring or seeing theological significance that I think is something, was alluded to in the articles, they're not stated outright. It's more of a risk among the Israeli Haredi community than the American one. I want to close with one final question before giving you an opportunity to share any closing messages you'd like, and if anyone would like to add questions of their own. But I can't offhand think of a work of contemporary Jewish thought, or even a compendium historically of Jewish thought, though you would know that better than I would, that brings in this diverse a range of writers. Rav David Lau and where he identifies, and Rav David Yosef, right, son of Chacham Ovadia. And on the other side, we have, or perhaps in the middle, Tamar Ross, Professor Tamar Ross, all the way to Ruth Calderon, and everyone in between. So maybe just to speak a moment in closing to the significance of putting together a volume of this sort that brings this really entire range of Jewish thought, almost, within the pages of one magnificent book.
Thank you. So I think it's absolutely very important that a book like this reflects a broad range of voices within our community. As a result, that we can both have an Ashkenazic man like Rav David Lau, Chief Rabbi of the State of Israel, as well as a Sephardic man, Rav David Yosef. For them to both be in the book, I think is wonderful. Was that your question?
I think even more broadly, because they're both still in the corpus of rabbinic literature, but to see them together with Dr. Tamar Ross or Professor Ruth Calderon, that was a little more unique than seeing different voices within.
I think the community of people who are reciting the prayer or are belonging to a congregation or a community, or their children going to a school where they're reciting the prayer, is diverse. I think more people in America might be familiar with a number of the educators or rabbis or community activists who are included in the book than even the Chief Rabbi of the State of Israel. And that's fine, because the beauty of our community is that it's not just a top-down, this is the leader and everybody else, their views don't matter, their views aren't to be included. But the range I felt was very important, because this isn't about me pushing a particular hashkafic or halachic perspective, but rather showing that there are those within our community who have a very diverse range of interpretations of the text of the prayer. One of the scholars, Professor Ronit Irshai, channels some ideas, and she shares some ideas from within feminist theory about the importance of expanding Avram Yitzchak Yaakov, Saraf Karach Leah, Chayalim Chayalot. Those might be, those would not be said. That version of the Mishaberach would not be said. That's not the official version of the IDF, the chief rabbin of the IDF. But then again, there are other communities that say things differently. And the beauty of this book is that there is a full range. One of the interesting, I reached out to a prominent Rosh Yeshiva of a Hesder Yeshiva and asked him to contribute to this volume. And he said to me that to be a Rosh Yeshiva of a Hesder Yeshiva at the time of war means that they can only, you have to be there fully 24/7 for the soldiers. He said, I'm not able to work on any other shiurim or to write anything else. He said, I'm sorry. He followed up and he said, but if I can suggest something to be included, can you talk about the concept of tefillah be'et tzara, a prayer at a time of communal distress? And when I reached out to the different authors, I asked them, can you reflect on the Mishaberach, about prayer in general, just different ideas? And different people responded different ways. Professor Elisheva Rossman Stolman, who's a scholar of literally the history of the Israeli army, she wrote about what it's like to be a mother of a soldier and being in a WhatsApp group of other mothers of the Hayaladim, of the children. Rabbi Haskell Lookstein, his article in a remarkable way, tells a story of the recitation of the Mishaberach for the IDF soldiers at KJ over the past 50 years, and how he takes cheshbon nefesh of sorts by saying that after COVID, they cut out certain extra things in davening. He says, but we put it back in right now. It's every day we're saying it at davening. One of the final articles that came in, the two final articles that came in, one is the foreword by Israeli President Isaac Herzog, and it's the remarks that he recited, that he delivered at the march in Washington several months ago. But also, and with this, the remarks by Cantor Chaim David Burson, former chief chazan of the Jewish Center, of what it was like for him to recite the Mishaberach in front of several 100,000 people at the rally in Washington. And whether it's in front of 300,000 people, whether it's at a makeshift minyan that people are having, and singing Mishaberach at the end of davening, along with Tehillim, along with singing Achenu, whatever it is, whatever is the opportunity for people to recalibrate and to focus on the soldiers, on their service, on their family members, and of course the hostages. That's just anything that can be done to raise that awareness. And it's the book is available on Amazon. We Baruch Hashem, we raised funds to support complimentary copies to give out to Jewish students on college campuses, for them to have a book in their arsenal, as it were, to share, for them to learn themselves, for them to share with friends, with opponents. The book hasn't been put into Kharim yet, although I'm sure that would help sales. But there's definitely a lot in the book for different people to gain. It's not a book that can be read straight. It's very difficult to read. It's a very real, emotion-filled work where the authors share their passion, it's a big zchut that I was able to work on this, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I will add my pitch for this this very, very beautiful book. I know Rabbi Levine opened speaking about your talk on Elie Wiesel at Disneyland. That's a talk that could make you both laugh and cry. This is not a book that can make you laugh. It can make you cry and then cry some more. But I also think the book contains a powerful kernel of hope in its sense of what we've faced before and how we've responded, and some of the tools that we have in our arsenal. So again, thank you on behalf of all of us and truly of Klal Yisrael for this very important contribution to the Jewish bookshelf. A few members have sent questions in over the course of your talk, so I tried to include them, but I do want to open up if anyone's brave enough to ask a question directly over Zoom, and just give a moment.
I want to mention also, earlier today, we published 500 copies of the book in Israel at a print shop in Israel, and it's being given out to government ministers, Hezler Rosh Yeshiva, soldiers, friends,
it's not quite like the pocket volume that you mentioned that was given to soldiers during the War of Independence, that they could slip in their pocket and go off to battle. This would hold a bullet, but probably not as convenient to head off into battle with.
Right. So if anyone has any questions.
So I will say that some of the questions I asked were, Panina, was that you raising your hand for a question, or just moving on the screen? I did incorporate some of the questions as we move through, but just with abundant gratitude. And Rabbi Levine, if there's anything you'd like to share in closing, Rabbi Menahem, we hope to host you again. We always are blessed by the breadth of your wisdom and your generosity in sharing it with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.